Hello, I'm Terry Quinn. I'm coming to you live from the Scottish Dementia Research Consortium and Brain Health Arc annual meeting in Edinburgh. But I'm taking a break from the conference to introduce this month's webinar. So this is our combined SDRC, Brain Health Arc and NHS Research Scotland research webinar for May. Now, I know you're here for the speaker, but in usual fashion, I'm going to do a little bit of a roundup of what's happening in the older adult and the dementia space in Scotland. And what I want to do, as I always do, is start with a little bit of housekeeping. Because the conference is on, we're not running our webinars live this month. So they're pre-recorded. That means you can't ask any live questions. But there is some Q&A at the end of the session. Both speakers are very happy for you to approach them if you have questions. We're recording the meeting and it's going to be on our new YouTube channel. Please check out the YouTube channel. It's got all of our content there. For future webinars, just let me know about content that you want featured, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Here we've got a little screenshot of our YouTube channel. Please do subscribe. All of the content that we've been creating over the last while, all of our webinars, all of our tutorials, all of our meetings are going to feature on the channel. So it really is an excellent resource, and I'd highly commend that you have a look at it. Many of you will have joined these webinars before, but for those of you who are new to the webinar, I will just give you a little bit of a background to the series. Last year and in years before, I found myself in a position where I was recording multiple webinars for different organisations, for NHS Research Scotland, for the ARC, for SDRC. I enjoyed recording all of those, but there's so much topic overlap that this year we thought we would share things, and we would have some webinars that would be shared across all three groups and some that would be separate. Here are some of the webinars that we've had already, some really fantastic speakers and topics. This month we are diverging a little bit, and for NHS Research Scotland we have Dr. Jane Mazzoli talking about cardiovascular ageing, and for SDRC and ARC we have Dr. Catherine Quinn talking about research and its emotional burden. I've heard both of the talks and they're fantastic, and you will enjoy them, I can promise you that. For this session we have one more webinar next month in June, and that's from Tom Welsh, and he's going to be talking about some of the special interest groups that exist in the dementia and the brain health space. So please do join us for that. And then finally, before we get on to the main event and the main speakers, as I always do, I want to just give you a bit of a roundup of some things that are happening that may be of interest to you. Yeah. The first thing is around NHS Research Scotland. So I'm often asked, what do NHS Research Scotland do? What do the clinical leads do? Well, now you can find out, because we've made this book that introduces the clinical leads for all of the different disciplines and tells you a little bit about what they do. That resource and lots of others are on the NHS Research Scotland website, and I would commend you to have a look at that. There's lots of great content there. Many of you will be aware of the Dunhill Medical Charity. They were one of the major funders of older adult research in the UK. Well, they've had a name change and a slight vision change. They're now called the Vivenza Foundation. Their focus is still very much older adults, so the area that we're all interested in. If you want to find more about what the Vivenza Foundation are up to, you can go to their website. As a bit of a teaser, I'm potentially planning a joint meeting with them. If you want to know more about that or any of the things I'm talking about, join up to our mailing list. One of the issues when you're working with older adults or people living with dementia is around capacity, consent. All of these really tricky issues are issues that I still struggle with. And I've been doing this for a while. So thankfully, from Cardiff University, there is some training resources available. They've been made by the excellent Victoria Shepherd, who works in this area. The URLs are there. I've had a look at them. I think they're really, really useful. And if you're involved in research with older adults or research with people living with dementia, you should really have a look at that.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you on the topic of cardiovascular frailty. My name is Jane Mazzoli, and I'm an Associate Professor of Ageing based at the University of Exeter and a Consultant Geriatrician at the Royal Devon University Healthcare NHS Trust. And I hold an NIHR Advanced Fellowship to understand and explore the topic of cardiovascular frailty. I lead the age group at the University of Exeter, and I'm going to talk today about a range of different research that we're doing to understand the topic of cardiovascular frailty and to better inform research into the future. So in Devon, we have a really accelerated ageing population, and actually we have one of the highest proportions of people aged over 85 in the UK. Indeed, that we already have 5% of the population aged 85 and over. So it's actually a really good place to be doing ageing research. And we're building a centre of excellence for ageing research at the University of Exeter. So this was epitomised for me by meeting these 87-year-old identical twins during one of my acute takes. And of course, one of the key parts was to ask them if they'd mind me using their story in my presentations thereafter. And what they really showed was people ageing healthily, actually, because although they did both present to the acute take, they were both able to be transferred back home within 72 hours and were living independently and separately, and were actually quite surprised to bump into each other in the hospital. So as you will know, as people interested in ageing research, the projected increase in the population means that we're going to double the number of people that are aged over 80 in the UK in the next 40 years. And so we need to start to better understand how to characterise and treat the concept that might be cardiovascular frailty that I'm going to be talking about in different guises during this talk. So first, to put us on the same page, the World Health Organization defines healthy aging as the process of developing and maintaining functional abilities that enable people to enjoy a state of well-being. In this photo, it depicts someone that is playing tennis into their 80s, but actually what that can mean is the things that keep the person authentically them. So what do you want to be doing into later life that keeps you you? That might be instances of spending time with family. It might be being able to read or listen to the radio or absorb material that you're interested in. It might be being able to sit in the garden and so on. And I think it's really useful as well to look at this slide, which is taken from the Chief Medical Officer's annual report from 2023 on health in an ageing society. It shows, for me, the difference between longevity and healthy aging. And it comes back to that concept of what healthy aging is. So do you want to be able to live forever if that quality of time lived is less than you would want? And so what you can see in the top bar is the people from the most deprived areas, and the bottom bar, the least deprived areas. And you can see that not only is the longevity reduced in those people from the highest areas of deprivation, but also the time lived in poor health, which is depicted in orange here, is elongated. And so one of the key concepts around multiple long-term conditions, but also cardiovascular frailty, is trying to reduce the years spent in poor health. This will be familiar to you as a basic schema on frailty over time and indeed functional ability over time. So this is taken from the British Geriatric Society, showing the periods of acute illness and then those recovery phases and the loss of return to the status of physical function that people were at prior to that episode of acute illness. And I think that this is really important when we're thinking about cardiovascular frailty as well, because actually, and here in blue you have the physiological robust healthy aging group, and in red those that are starting to deteriorate in function, but also accumulate markers of frailty with the acute illnesses and then not returning back to their prior baseline. And that concept of physiological vulnerability is a key part of cardiovascular frailty. So perhaps, and I'll come back to this on some of the later slides, there are ways in which we can use cardiovascular health to understand that deterioration in physiological vulnerability as a marker of frailty development, but also there may be elements of the cardiovascular physiology that can help us to understand how to delay that physiological reduction and indeed that deterioration into disability and loss of function. And perhaps by thinking about a more personalised approach to cardiovascular optimization in later life, we can even delay the functional decline and that onset of disability. And so I think that those two concepts of physiological vulnerability and disability threshold are really key to trying to start to define the phenotype of cardiovascular frailty, but also think about what we might do on that life course approach to cardiovascular disease to really try and delay the frailty acceleration that can be associated with cardiovascular frailty and that loss of function. So the development of cardiovascular frailty, I was trying to conceptualise it and thinking about the different stages and steps across the life course. And so some of the key parts of understanding cardiovascular frailty as a phenotype will be understanding the mechanisms that lead to the development of cardiovascular frailty as a phenotype. And so that might be genetic risk of cardiovascular disease or genetic risk of different factors that might accumulate to lead people to be at risk of cardiovascular frailty in later life. But also risk factors that we might be exposed to across the life course, whether that's environmental factors such as smoking, or whether it's personal factors and risk factors such as conditions with hypertension or BMI, etc. Then the other aspect is about whether there are things that we can do to better prevent the onset of cardiovascular frailty. Again, whether that's related to cardiovascular risk factors or indeed related to early warning and understanding that physiological decline earlier so that we might make different decisions on tailoring management. But also leaning into a more personalised management. And we've done some work in the group as well around pharmacogenetics that aren't part of the talk today, but certainly should be part of that future personalised approach. And so I think that there's lots of research to do to understand cardiovascular frailty. Part of it is around the mechanisms of the development. Part of it is around really pinning down what the phenotype of cardiovascular frailty might be defined as. There's work to do on prevention of cardiovascular frailty and then on personalised management of both cardiovascular disease and of the phenotype of cardiovascular frailty. And so part of what we've done at the University of Exeter is to try and understand different aspects of that. And one key part of the story is hypertension and blood pressure. And to understand blood pressure in later life, one must first understand the life course story of hypertension. And this is not our work, but shows from Wills et al. The life course of blood pressure, which we are taught increases across the life course. And indeed it does, as shown by multiple cohort studies. But actually, when you get to age 70, the cohort studies don't agree with what happens next. So in some studies, blood pressure continues to rise. In some studies, it plateaus, and in others, it declines. And we think that that might be a key part of understanding the different trajectories of cardiovascular health in later life, and indeed in that physiological vulnerability. And people are well represented in cohort studies across the life course that are healthier. And so there might be a healthy bias to the data that we're looking at, albeit that people in some of those studies were recruited younger and followed up long term. There is often a loss to follow up of people once they become either cognitively or physically more disabled or frail, and therefore they can become less well represented in that data. And so actually people who have developed frailty, there's a lot less cohort information, but also trial information to understand their needs and what their personalised approach should be. And so one of the key things that we've wanted to do at the age group in the University of Exeter is to use health data science approaches and also genetic approaches to understand those people who are not well represented in the existing studies. So what do we already know about blood pressure and frailty? Well, we know that hypertension in older adults is associated with increased frailty and actually accelerated frailty, accelerated functional decline. And we know that frail people, so people living with frailty, have a higher proportion of hypertension diagnoses, cardiovascular disease, and indeed worse outcomes with cardiovascular events and a higher mortality associated. But that's not the whole story. We know that treating hypertension in older adults is still important, so there's really good evidence for reducing high blood pressures in midlife into later life, and this is all supported by randomised control trial evidence from a plethora of studies. And in the recent updated Cochrane review, it showed that in people aged over 65, treating to a target of less than 140 is beneficial for cardiovascular disease and can reduce 10 in 1,000, so the number needed to treat would be 100 to reduce cardiovascular events in over 65, 6 of which of those events would be stroke. But the optimum target remains unclear, and I could do a whole talk on the sprint effect in terms of international blood pressure guidelines, but that's not why we're here today. And only to say that the optimum target remains unclear. And while observational data can't give us the target for healthy people, it can start to understand what happens with attained blood pressures and what the associations are between attained blood pressures and outcomes. And so part of the problem is that at the moment, from the trial evidence, we don't have long enough follow-up, we don't have well-characterised people with frailty or disability or cognitive impairment represented in those trials. And we don't have a lot of the outcomes that are important to people with frailty, such as more detailed, longer-term falls outcomes and understanding people who, for example, have midlife hypertension diagnoses rather than those people who are in the blood pressure trials who have perhaps late life onset hypertension and indeed resistant hypertension in order to qualify for those trials. The other people who are not well represented in the trials on blood pressure in later life are those people with postural hypotension or a drop in their blood pressure when they stand up. And I'll come back to the prognosis of standing blood pressure as well in some work that we've done. So this slide was part of some work that James Shepherd led on understanding who was included in the trials. And indeed, you can see here that when they looked at people cross-sectionally in English GP practices aged over 80, they found that the people, only 1.7% of those of the population would have been eligible for HIVIT. And part of the reason that they were excluded was that they had too well-controlled blood pressure. And this is what I'm talking about with the people with perhaps midlife hypertension who are actually well treated or have normal or indeed lower blood pressures. And there were other exclusion criteria as well that are outside the scope of today's talk, because otherwise, as I said, we'd spend the whole time talking about the blood pressure trials. And then, again, while more would have been eligible for the SPRINT trial, you can see that nearly 40% were excluded because of normal or well-controlled blood pressures. And so that leaves us, as I said, with this lack of understanding of really where the balance of risk lies with people with frailty. And so we've been doing some work in the age group at the University of Exeter to try to understand, using health data science approaches, the outcomes associated with real-world attained blood pressures in older people. In this study, we looked at over 400,000 people from the clinical practice research data link with GP data from England, looking at the associations between blood pressure and outcomes. And this slide shows the outcomes according to systolic blood pressure, the cardiovascular outcomes of heart failure, of coronary heart disease, which was MI, and procedural interventions, so such as stenting, to try and get away from the fact that we're not just talking about angina and MI, we're also talking about those proactive procedures, and stroke outcomes, including TIA and stroke. And we found that elevated blood pressures across frailty groups were associated with cardiovascular risk. And so this is the fit group, we're represented by the squares, the mild frailty with the circle, and the moderate to severe frailty with the triangle, which was a smaller group, and so therefore the confidence intervals are wider for the association with outcomes. And this slide shows the association with all-cause mortality. And what we found was that with systolic blood pressures less than 130, and in this observational data, were associated with increased mortality across frailty status in people aged over 75. And in those over 85 and those people who were frail and over 75, hypertension was not associated with increased mortality outcomes. Now, obviously, this is partly reverse causality, and so that association between hypotension preceding death, but we excluded those people within 2 years of death and the blood pressure measures for those people. And so actually, we did find that although I'm not advocating for encouraging hypertension or enabling hypertension in later life, there was an observational association between relative hypertension and reduced mortality compared to those with overt hypotension. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about why that might be the case, and to really try to unpick the observational data. And we found that when we looked at blood pressures that were recorded in routine healthcare data for over 50,000 people in later life, that blood pressure peaked on average 14 to 18 years prior to death. And so on these graphs, it shows the systolic blood pressure and the time to death in years. And what you can see is that in those people in their 60s, the blood pressure declines were less marked, but still peaked on average 14 to 18 years prior to death. And that decline was more accelerated in the older age groups. We looked at that in the least frail versus the most frail, and again found accelerated declines in people that were more frail. And so we wanted to try to understand that in more detail. Are people that are being congratulated in later life for well-controlled blood pressure actually moving towards potentially harmful hypotension? Are we overshooting for some people? Are we overtreating for some people? And are there people who have had midlife hypertension and then get blood pressure declines in later life, in whom they might have a sort of post-hypertension syndrome? And we're aiming to understand this in more detail physiologically, but also it really feeds into that hypothesis that midlife hypertension and late life hypertension are distinct phenotypes, and that perhaps this might be part of unlocking cardiovascular frailty and understanding personalised treatment. Perhaps it's part of the story behind what the blood pressure targets should be as well. And perhaps those in whom there are blood pressure declines or steeper blood pressure declines are the group in whom we should be considering less aggressive treatment to target. Indeed, we're progressing this group, this hypothesis currently, and my colleagues Sandra Arikel and Osei Owusu are working on that at the moment and considering what drives the blood pressure declines and what the potential markers of cardiovascular frailty from a blood pressure point of view might be. to try to define the phenotype, but also to understand the physiology by looking at, for example, the MRI changes associated. So the NICE guidelines state to treat to blood pressure, systolic blood pressure of less than 150 in people aged over 80, but also to measure postural blood pressures in people who have postural symptoms and who are older and who have falls and other groups such as those with diabetes, and to treat to a standing blood pressure in people with a significant postural drop in their blood pressure or with postural symptoms, so such as in those people who fall. Now, we wanted to try to understand more about the evidence for the risk versus benefit of treating to standing blood pressure. As a geriatrician, it feels like it makes sense to treat to the standing blood pressure, but actually, is there evidence on the prognosis of standing blood pressure? And so we assembled a collaborative team from the University of Exeter, Bristol, and Oxford, and we have funding from the NIHR School for Primary Care Research to explore the prognosis of standing blood pressure. The study is called STAND, and it's the standing blood pressure and its association with major adverse cardiovascular disease and adverse events, by which we mean the falls outcomes. The STAND team, as I said, is a collaborative approach, and the first step was to perform a systematic review of studies that quantified the association between standing blood pressure and cardiovascular events, injurious falls, and mortality outcomes. And the second stage is to perform an individual participant data analysis from using data from studies that had both the standing blood pressure and the outcomes of interest. So as you'll appreciate, we spent a lot of time doing the systematic review. We screened over 13,000 studies and we identified 19 studies that were eligible for inclusion in the systematic review. Unfortunately, there were no studies that reported an estimate between the association of standing blood pressure and the outcomes of interest. And so we ended up doing a narrative review on this. And the individual participant data analysis is ongoing. And this work has been led by Osei and by Sinead, and the individual participant data analysis is being led by Ariel at Oxford University. I wanted to talk a bit about Gemini, which is some work on multiple long-term conditions that we've been doing over the last 3.5 years, which is a collaborative research led by Professor Tim Frayling, and is looking at the genetics of multiple long-term conditions. While at the moment it doesn't lean into very late life and cardiovascular frailty, I think that the understanding of the overlap between conditions as they accumulate across the life course and that genetic understanding could really help to unpick the phenotype and inform what we do for precision treatment approaches. So I don't expect you to see the image properly, but actually the QR code links to the paper. And what I've also included here is the details of the Shiny app, where you can have a look at the data that shows the overlap, both observationally in data from millions of people, routine healthcare data from the UK, but also from the Spanish equivalent called CIDI app. And what this graph that you can't quite see in detail here shows is that 72 chronic health conditions against 72 health conditions, and where the observed overlap is between the conditions, so which ones co-occur most frequently, but also looking at the genetic overlap between pairs of long-term conditions. There were lots of these that were unsurprising, such as, bundles of cardiovascular conditions. You would expect their genetics to have a significant overlap as well. But then there were conditions where we might not have expected them to occur more commonly. And so it's been really useful, and there are more papers coming out on understanding the risk factors between the development, but also what the more precise genetic overlap is between conditions. And that could help ultimately with what I was talking about prevention of cardiovascular frailty, and also, as I said, the precision approaches. For example, this slide shows the co-occurrence of type 2 diabetes and hypertension. in millions of people in the clinical practice research data link, so UK data. This isn't specific to older people, but across the life course of people aged 40 and over. And what it shows is that a lot of the hypertension and type 2 diabetes overlaps in, and so you can see that that 755,000 people had both hypertension and type 2 diabetes. Hypertension was much more common than type 2 diabetes alone in the data. And the bar chart shows how much time accrued between the diagnosis. So actually, is there a potential intervention window between the development of conditions that we might be able to target for better treatment or prevention? And you can see that these first three bars will represent the first year. So there's a cluster of diagnoses that occur at the same time between the hypertension and type 2 diabetes, and some of that will be screening related and related to optimization of health as people are more exposed to healthcare professionals. But then we can see that actually there may be there are lags between the development of the second condition that we may be able to use as an intervention and prevention window to optimize treatment and to optimize risk factors. Taking this a step further, my colleague Beth Voller, who's a PhD student with our group, has been looking at the precise genetic overlap between health conditions such as with hypertension and type 2 diabetes, and can we identify specific areas of genetics that might be able to be a drug target, for example, or that we might already have a treatment that would be able to be involved in better prevention of the second condition, or indeed in dual optimization of the two conditions coexisting. And so you see, therefore, how the genetics might be able to inform part of the precision approach in cardiovascular disease management, but also, I would argue, in the development and prevention of cardiovascular frailty. And when we're thinking about the life course of genetics, well, genetics are assigned at conception, but actually the genetics of the phenotypes are done in these large cohort studies. So, for example, if you've got hypertension at the point at which you enter the study, then you're considered as having hypertension. And a lot of the studies are done in midlife. And so I think that a lot of the genetic understanding is based, therefore, on the genetics of, up to perhaps late midlife rather than the very old. And so part of what our newly appointed PhD student, Jason Yang, is going to be doing is looking at those aging genetic phenotypes. And so I think that might start again to unlock the understanding of the mechanisms of cardiovascular frailty. We looked at a slide very similar to this earlier, which showed the trajectories of frailty and these acute declines into reduced function, and then the reduction of function to disability over time. And the time can vary greatly, but this shows the end-stage heart or lung failure. And what strikes me in the description is the percentage of people mostly sitting or lying down and bedbound over time. And so part of this then is how can we better optimise people with cardiovascular disease and intervene to be able to preserve function and to reduce that accelerated decline. So one of the things I wanted to tell you about was the CHART trial, which is an NIHR HTA funded randomised control trial looking at comprehensive geriatric assessment in people with heart failure preserved ejection fraction. And in fact, we're looking for more sites, and we'd really love for Scottish sites to be part of this trial. And so if you're interested, either get in touch with me or with Vicky Goodwin or Andy Clegg, who are the co-PIs for the trial. We are recruiting people with frailty and heart failure preserved ejection fraction. And the intervention is a comprehensive geriatric assessment with a therapy team and a geriatrician or appropriate other, so whether that's a senior registrar or a nurse consultant, leading a comprehensive geriatric assessment with MDT embedded as well, and the therapy team doing a 12-week rehabilitation programme versus usual care. The outcome is activities of daily living as the primary outcome. And it would be really great to discuss this with any people that are interested in becoming a site. The people with heart failure preserved ejection fraction are a group with high levels of frailty and potential unmet needs. And so it really is part of the group in whom we may be able to offer more meaningful interventions. But first of all, we need to develop and see what those look like. So this is part of the first step. Alongside trials, I strongly believe in the health data science approach. And one of the things that we're looking at with Rhian Hopkins, who's a research associate in our group, is cardiovascular disease in routine healthcare records and using more granular data via the Southwest Safe Data environment and health records from secondary care to understand, again, what the potential markers of optimum treatment and potential overtreatment might be in different cardiovascular disease in the context of frailty. We're also working, this is Jay Rothery, he's one of our PhD students, on understanding the role of technology in thinking about cardiovascular frailty. So, firstly, is it feasible to use devices such as smartwatches, which are being embedded already in routine healthcare from, for example, the virtual wards? Are they acceptable to older people? And can they help us in understanding the interface between cardiovascular frailty and mobility and falls as well? And so that's something that we're in the process of working on at the moment, both in physiological lab settings with our colleagues in physiotherapy, such as Professor Helen Dawes, but also using data approaches. And so you can see that our breadth of work across the group encompasses from the mechanistic with Gemini and the genetic approaches that I talked about, the phenotype development, so such as Sandra and Assay's work, looking at health data science and the blood pressure changes that might demarcate cardiovascular frailty, and then thinking about what opportunities there might be from personalised management and prevention, both from the genetics and potential target perspective, but also looking at health data science approaches to our treatment and through the trial approach of comprehensive geriatric assessment in heart failure preserved ejection fraction. So that was a quick tour through some of the work that we're doing on the theme of cardiovascular frailty. It certainly hasn't presented all of the answers on the phenotype, the mechanisms, the best treatment plans, but I'm really interested in people that want to discuss some of these concepts further, and it's the sort of work that we'll be doing over the next few years. Thank you so much.